Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure to be able to give this third lecture in this series, looking at some aspects of Christian theology and trying to make connections with the world of science. And let me also just say welcome to those of you who are beneath this room. We can't see you, but we know you're there, we think you're there. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is look at the idea of creation. It's a very interesting idea. I'm going to explore with you some ways of thinking about it, and then begin to make some connections. And one of the connections I'm going to be making is with this fascinating question about what is sometimes called the fine-tuning of the universe. In other words, the universe seems to have some qualities that make it ideally suited to the emergence of life. So what does that mean, if anything? And obviously I'll be looking at that towards the end of this lecture. But to begin with, I want to just open up the discussion about the whole idea of creation and just see what sort of approaches we might adopt and try and follow some of them through. Now, obviously, the idea that the world is created is one of the most widely encountered and indeed fundamental religious ideas. And you find this in most religions. I think if we were to try and categorize these, we might say that one idea is that the world is brought out of nothing. Another might be that the world is shaped as a result of combating forces of chaos or something like that. And another approach, which you find particularly in ancient Near Eastern religions, is that in some way creation is the outcome of a God giving birth or something like that. And so I'm going to explore some of these ideas this morning. We might, I think, begin to look at an analogy, a story, which I think is very, very helpful here. And it's the story of the Greek philosopher Aristippus. Aristippus, who I don't think any of us really have heard of, is not very well known. And I'll come to Augustine in a moment. But Aristippus was a Stoic philosopher. And for some reason we don't quite understand, he found himself shipwrecked on an island. Now, the island actually was Rhodes, but he didn't know what the island was. And he and his companions naturally wanted to know, is there somebody already on this island? Is it inhabited? And as they walked along the shoreline, they noticed that there were some patterns traced in the sand. Geometrical patterns. And basically said there has to be somebody here because those patterns couldn't have emerged by accident. Therefore, the presence of those patterns on the beach is an indication that intelligent life exists on this island. Now, some of you will say, this sounds a bit like Robinson Crusoe. And I hate to say to you that Robinson Crusoe scholars have noticed this and just wondered if perhaps Crusoe came across these publications. There's a very famous English language edition of Aristippus, which actually has as a preface, a foreword, a sort of a frontispiece, a very nice diagram of this man poring over these geometrical patterns on the beach. And you can just imagine him looking at a footprint instead of these patterns. But the key point, I think, is this, that as you look at the world, you begin to wonder, are there patterns here that suggest we aren't on our own? Are there patterns here that suggest this is not simply accidental, that there's some kind of design lying behind the universe? As I'm sure you will know, these kind of thoughts have been thought for millennia. People have really looked at the world and thought there is something about this that makes us think that there has to be something lying behind the world. We begin to wonder not simply where these come from, but also whether there's some deeper meaning in the natural world. Is there, in effect, some system of signs within the world that gives us clues about its origination or indeed its deeper significance? So there's a very interesting debate that emerges from reflection on the structure of the world. Is it self-sufficient? Is it an end in itself? Or is it like some kind of sign which points beyond itself? And of course, many answers have been given to these questions and they've been debated endlessly. And certainly one of the most interesting explorations of this is found in Christianity. You might think of, for example, Psalm 19, which talks about the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord. Those who enjoy listening to Haydn's Creation will know he uses that text a lot. Or we might think of this very famous quote from Augustine of Hippo, a Christian theologian of the early 5th century, who wrote these words, "You have made us for ourselves, for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. You've made us for yourself, my apologies for the typo, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. And what Augustine is reflecting on there is not simply the question about the creation of the world, the status of the world around him, but also his own status. What is there special about human nature? Is there something about human nature that makes it special? And his own answer is that in some way, human nature is being created to relate to God, and until and unless that happens, then we have this experience of emptiness or wandering or restlessness. And for Augustine, this theological framework, if you like, helps him to make sense of human nature. So following through on this idea, one of the, I think, the most interesting human intuitions about the world is that this isn't really our home, that we're more like sojourners who are passing through this world on our way somewhere else. And certainly you find this idea of thinking in the Old Testament. It's certainly there in Christianity. But it's also there in a movement that many of you will have heard of, which is a movement we call Gnosticism. Again, Gnosticism. And this movement really began to emerge in late classical antiquity. And Gnosticism basically developed the idea that matter is evil. That in fact this is a material universe, but we are spiritual creatures. And so we don't really belong here. We are trapped, if you like, as spiritual beings in a material body. And the argument was that we need to be liberated from our bodies, liberated from this universe. We are, to use a very famous Gnostic phrase, gold in the mud. Again, gold in the mud. You may have heard that phrase. And the argument is that we are trapped in this material world, and somehow we've got to get out of it and find our way home. And some forms of Gnosticism developed these immensely complicated systems of passwords. The Greek word gnosis means knowledge. Gnosticism was really about a secret kind of knowledge, which meant that if you knew the right things to say, you could in effect get out of this world and find your way back to the place where we really belong. So this idea that the world is created, that the world in some way has an origin, didn't just exist forever, is very, very significant. I want to just begin to open it up for more general discussion. From the outset, Christianity was very, very clear that the world around us wasn't itself divine, but was nevertheless of divine origin. Now, we just need to try and make sure we got that framework right. Not itself divine, but coming from God. Or if I can put it like this, not itself divine, but bearing the imprint of divinity. Two different ideas, and very, very interesting in many ways. The argument is that God brought the universe into existence, and in doing so, he established an order which reflected God's character without itself being God. So it's a very interesting idea, and one of the questions might be, where does this take us? Now, interestingly, this would, I think, take another lecture, but let me say very, very briefly that one of the things you can do is ask this. If you read the Old Testament and try and group texts roughly according to their age, and then ask how important is the idea of creation, you find that in the early period, actually this is interesting, but not really all that important. It suddenly becomes really important when Israel finds itself in exile in Babylon. And many of you will know that story very, very well. Basically, the Babylonians invade the area of Israel, and they deport the population of Jerusalem to Babylon, basically to ensure political stability in the area of Israel. And so the people of Israel find themselves in exile in a strange land. And Old Testament scholars think that in effect helped the doctrine of creation become much more important than it otherwise was. So let me try and explain why that is. In the ancient Near East, as many of you will know, there were national gods. These were understood to be gods specifically linked to given regions or given nations, and that keeping this God on the right side was essential for national well-being. Israel, although it thought of their God as a kind of national God, saw him as being much bigger than that. He was the one God who created all the earth. And even though they were in exile in Babylon, they had not left their God behind them in Israel. God, they argued, was the creator of the whole world, and therefore he was with them even in exile in Babylon. And you begin to see emphasis falling on the doctrine of creation. If God made the world, then surely God can get us out of this mess in Babylon. So doctrine of creation almost became a framework of hope, saying, look, although we are in a situation where we're a long way from our true homeland, we can trust in this God who is able to bring us home. And so you might think of this quote from the prophecy of Isaiah, which I'll read to you, which expresses this hope quite well. This is from Isaiah chapter 44. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, and who by myself spread out the earth. And the point being made there is, look, if God did this in the past, then surely God can redeem his people in the present. So I think you find this idea of creation becoming increasingly important during what's sometimes called this exilic period in Babylon. So let's try and unpack what the core themes of any idea of creation might be. Now, it seems to me the first of these would be the idea of origination. Origination. In other words, the world came into being at some point. The world has not always existed, but came into existence. And you'll find a lot of writers treating the idea of creation as a divine causation of both the universe itself and, of course, as ourselves as its inhabitants. So we'll come back to the idea, but first theme, origination. Second theme is that of intentionality. Again, intentionality. The point being made here is that this didn't just happen, it was made to happen. In other words, there's something purposeful or intentional about the whole idea of creation. And the third aspect is that of signification. Again, signification. And the point being made here is something like this. If the universe was made by God, then in some way it's seen as representing or perhaps being a sign of God himself. In other words, there's some kind of link, some kind of, if I use the jargon, semiotic link between the world and God as its creator. And therefore, in some way, looking at the world might point back to God as its creator. Again, think of that quote I mentioned from Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. That kind of idea is there. Now, each of those three aspects obviously needs a lot of further exploration. So let's just begin to think a bit more about the idea of origination. As many of you will know, secular Greek philosophers of the classic period, such as Aristotle, weren't that impressed with the idea of creation or origination. For Aristotle, the universe had always been there. And therefore, it was meaningless to talk about the idea of origination or creation because the universe simply had been there, always would be there, and therefore it was not possible to speak about having a beginning or indeed having an end. And this is one of the areas in which tension emerged between Christian writers such as Augustine, who basically said, look, that's what Aristotle says, but we say the universe did come into being. And as many of you will know, during the Middle Ages, there was this rediscovery of Aristotle in the Western Academy. And in the 13th and 14th centuries especially, you find Christian writers using Aristotle extensively as a kind of dialogue partner. Aristotle is very stimulating. He helps us to set our arguments well. He gives us lots of food for thought. But they found themselves in tension with him at points, and one of them was this tension between the Christian idea the world had an origin and Aristotle's idea the world has always been there. And interestingly, Aristotle's idea that the world has always been here was fairly widely accepted inside the scientific community until actually surprisingly recently. Some of you will know of a work called Worlds in the Making. Again, Worlds in the Making by a writer called Svante Arrhenius. Let me see if I put him up here. No. I should have, I'm sorry about that. But this man Arrhenius wrote his famous book called Worlds in the Making in 1906. And he summarized the scientific consensus of his day as in effect being, look, there is an infinite self-perpetuating universe. It has no beginning, no end, but there is localized rearrangement of energy and matter. And he was simply there saying, this is what the scientific community thinks. So to have any idea of the universe as having an origin was really seen as being quite out of sync with scientific orthodoxy. One of the interesting points, of course, here is that I think you all know, since about 1920, evidence has begun to accumulate which really suggests that the universe did indeed have an origin. The science is very interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about some of its aspects later in this lecture. But basically, people began to realize that the universe was expanding, and the easiest way of explaining various aspects of this expansion was to say that there was some kind of cosmic explosion that you and I would now call the Big Bang, and that brought the universe into existence. And that clearly raises all kinds of questions, and we'll be looking at some of them in this lecture. What's interesting, I think, is that I mentioned that earlier some Christian writers found Aristotle quite difficult because he had talked about the eternity of the world. I think some scientific writers found this new way of thinking difficult as well. Fred Hoyle, for example, a well-known astronomer, didn't really like the idea of the Big Bang because it sounded a little bit religious. So it's a very interesting point that actually whatever position you take on this idea of the origination of the universe does have kind of way religious implications which are very interesting to follow through. Now let me make it clear, in talking about the universe having an origin, that doesn't necessarily imply that there is a God or indeed that the Christian doctrine of creation is right. But it certainly suggests there's a very interesting conversation to be had here. Because certainly, at least at the moment, the scientific way of thinking about the origins of the universe maps onto, but actually is not identical with, a Christian way of thinking about creation. While Christians would argue, I think, that God brought the universe into existence, I think atheist scientists would simply say, well, look, it just happened. There's no need to provide an explanation. It's just there. And that actually is as far back as you can go. Maybe it came into existence by a process that we just don't understand or in some way caused its own existence. So the idea of origination, the first of those three ideas I touched on, is really very interesting. And again, we'll be coming back to that. What about the second idea, that of intentionality? Well, I think it's a very interesting point. If it's right, then the key idea is this world is not an accident, nor are we. We can speak of life having a purpose, or perhaps the universe having a meaning. And so you can see that does open up some very interesting questions for discussion. And one of the questions here would be whether you can read this off from intelligent reflection on nature. That comes to our point about signs, which we'll be looking at again later. The book of Job, which is one of the most interesting examples of the wisdom literature of the ancient Near East, talks about wisdom as being something that's hidden deep within the world. It's not something you see on the surface. You have to go much deeper. And so the question you have to ask then is whether there's some deeper structure to the world which is hidden from a casual or superficial glance, but which really is there for those who are committed and are prepared to go deep into things. And so again, this picks up the idea of creation as a sign. In some way, creation, the natural world around us, is able to point beyond itself. And when understood correctly, then, you could say that the world around us echoes or reflects something of God. Now, as you all know, I think nature is very ambiguous. I mean, it's very easy to look at a beautiful sunset and say, that is just wonderful. You know, that might point towards a creator. But there are darker aspects of nature. For example, the food chain. And you look at that and you're not quite so sure. There's a darker side to the world. I suppose one of the questions you have to ask is this: if nature is aesthetically ambiguous, some bits nice, some not so nice, then how can you use nature as a way of, in effect, moving from affirming the beauty of creation to saying something about God? If it's more ambiguous than that, what can you do about it? I think that is a very important point, and one that is very interesting to discover. And G.K. Chesterton is one of those writers who puts things very, very well. And he wrote these words back about 1912. Let me read them to you, see if they make sense, and then try and explain them to you. He says, "One must somehow find a way of loving the world without trusting it." Let me read that again. One must somehow find a way of loving the world without trusting it. What does he mean by that? What I think he's getting at is this. Loving the world's one thing, but trusting it means, in effect, allowing it to answer all our questions. And what Chesterton was really worried about was this aesthetic and moral ambiguity of nature. In other words, if we are saying, look, we need a system of moral values, and we look at nature, and we see the strong winning out all the time, the brutality of the natural process, nature being red in tooth and claw, that very famous phrase from Tennyson's In Memoriam. Well, you know, is that beautiful? Is that moral? And what Chesterton is saying is, look, you can love nature, and you can find a way of interpreting nature, but you don't let nature tell you what's right. Otherwise, you end up in a bit of a mess. It's a very interesting quote, and Chesterton was trying to hold these things together. So there are lots of interesting questions here. If we take a Christian approach to nature, we could say something like this: that the beauty of creation echoes the greater beauty of God. That we sometimes hear something of the melodies of the New Jerusalem in this world, wafted, as it were, by a passing breeze. And we can, in effect, argue that this world is a kind of scaled-down version of something greater, more beautiful, more wonderful, but seen through a smoky mirror, a dark glass, some sort of image like that, which means that it's an ambiguous thing. We don't see it as clearly as we would like. But nevertheless, it's enough to allow us to realize that something of immense beauty lies beyond us and makes us long to enter there. So let me now begin to ask a question. Given that this idea of creation is really quite interesting, how do we understand that world creation? So what I'm going to do is just look briefly at the Old Testament and just say, what sort of models of creation, what sort of understandings of creation can we find there? And then open up a little bit further by looking at Christian ideas and see where those take us. Now, as I was saying earlier, the idea of God as creator is quite important in the Old Testament, and in my view becomes especially important during the period of the exile in Babylon. And again, it's one of the themes is that nature itself is not divine. You worship God, you don't worship nature. Or perhaps more importantly, if you read the Genesis creation accounts, one of the things you'll notice is that it emphasizes that God creates the greater light, i.e. the sun, the lesser light, i.e. the moon, and the stars. In other words, sun, moon, stars are all part of the created order. They're not divine. And one of the points the Genesis creation narrative is saying to Israel is, look, you do not need to be frightened by the sun, the moon, and the stars. They can't do you any harm. And so there's this sort of way subversion of any of these astrological religions which felt that you had to somehow do certain things, make sacrifices to these astral powers to keep you on their right side. So certainly that idea is ruled out. But I think we find there's basically two dominant models of creation. And let me look at these two ideas. Most of you will probably be familiar with these anyway, but I'm hoping this will give you a little framework just to help you organize these ideas more effectively. Basically, a key theme in the Old Testament is that creation is about ordering. In other words, it's about a regular universe. And the first approach we find is this, that creation is the imposition of order on a formless chaos. In other words, there's something that's there, but it's messed up. It's not structured. And creation is here understood as God imposing order on something that's amorphous, something that's shapeless, something that itself is disorganized. And interestingly, we find this certainly in Genesis creation account. But of course, I'm sure many of you will know the image mostly through the image of a potter, which is basically the idea that God takes a piece of formless matter and shapes it into something that's structured and ordered. We find that in Isaiah and Jeremiah. And although it's really about God being able to do what he likes with the created order, it's actually a very helpful idea in terms of thinking about the doctrine of creation. So that's one idea. Creation is about imposing order on a shapeless mass. The second idea is actually quite similar to that, but it has a difference, and you'll see it immediately. This is also about creation as the imposition of order. But instead of thinking rather abstractly about this, in other words, there is this abstract shapelessness which is put into right order, the forces of chaos are personified. In other words, these are beasts, these are monsters which need to be defeated. And in the Old Testament, we find a number of words used to describe these. And again, I think many of you will recognize this: Behemoth, Leviathan, Rahab, Tannin, or Yam. And these are portrayed as enemies that God subdues. In other words, these are forces of chaos, and in the act of creation, God defeats these forces of chaos and subdues them, and in doing so, creates an ordered world. Now, there are lots of interesting things here you could look at. For example, the way in which there are parallels here between Old Testament thinking and ancient Canaanite or indeed Ugaritic thought. But one of the points I want to make to you is this. Israel was always worried that this subjugation of chaos was reversible. In other words, that, if I can put it like as a leading theme in the Old Testament, is that God puts the land and the sea in the right places, and so you're going to be all right. But what happens if chaos returns? If, in effect, there are floods, if there are earthquakes? This is very much a theme that we find in the Old Testament. And so what I thought we might do is look at a little text from Isaiah, which some of you will know. I'm just going to tease out a few themes here which I think are very interesting. This is from Isaiah chapter 59, written during the exilic period. Very important. It's about the doctrine of creation being important. And it's all about, really, Israel being told, look, trust this God, because in the past, God created the world and defeated the forces of chaos, and now you're in exile, okay, but the God who defeated the forces of chaos in the past can be relied upon to defeat Babylon in the present. So the text is very interesting. Awake, awake, put on strength, the arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces? Again, this personification of the forces of chaos. who pierced the dragon? Again, another personification. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? And again, it's very much talking about this idea of creation as the imposition of order, as the exercise of divine authority, and then transferring that to the present and saying the God who acted like this in the past may be relied upon to do the same in the present. So lots of interesting ideas there to follow through. Now, some of you will notice that in talking about the Old Testament, I've talked really in terms of the imposition of order on something that's already there. It might be a force of chaos, it might be chaotic matter, but there's something already there. One of the interesting questions to ask is this. In the Old Testament, do we find the idea of creation as bringing something into existence from nothing, or is it really about taking something that's already there and doing something with it? Now, you may think I'm wrong here, but I'm going to suggest that in the Old Testament we don't really find that idea of creation out of nothing. If you think, for example, of the Genesis text, most of you will probably have read this at some point. In the beginning, God created the world, and it talks about the Spirit hovering over the face of the deep. Now, many Old Testament scholars say that the image of the deep is actually a symbol of forces of chaos. And again, it's not really about God bringing things into existence from nothing. It's much more the deep being ordered and changed into something that is structured and inhabitable. But in the Christian tradition, the idea of creation as coming into existence from nothing becomes established at a very early stage. It's one of the best distinguishing characteristics if you wanted to make a comparison between Christianity and Judaism. More recent Jewish writers actually have been much more sympathetic to the idea of creation out of nothing. But if you look at a medieval Jewish theologian like Maimonides, he's very much into creation as ordering, not creation as bringing into existence from nothing. So from a Christian perspective, what ideas might we think of for creation? Well, I'm going to suggest there are three that are worth looking at, and there they are. The first one I think will strike you as strange. The second two I think you'll see immediately. Let's begin then with the first, which is the most difficult, the idea of emanation. This idea was widely used in the patristic period. That's the very first period of Christian history in which Christian thinking was deeply shaped by Platonic ideas, by ideas originating from Hellenistic philosophy. And one of these is this idea of emanation. This is difficult for us to grasp today because we just don't think like this anymore. But back then, back around the year 300, 400, it was very, very natural to think in these terms. I'm going to try and explain what this idea means. The argument is that creation is analogous to heat or light being radiated from the sun or from a human source such as a fire. So imagine the sun emanating light. It's a natural process by which the nature of the sun is such that it generates light. And the argument is the nature of God is such that God emanates the creation in the same way as the sun radiates light and heat. So there is a natural connection between God and the creation. Now, I think most of us today would find this an unnatural way of thinking. It's not something that would really strike us as being very plausible, and there are some difficulties with it. Let me just mention two, which I think probably have occurred to you as I've been just talking about this ever so briefly. Number one, this doesn't really sound like creation at all. I mean, if we say creation is about some sort of intentional action, well, I mean, to the best of our knowledge, the sun just radiates heat and light. It doesn't think, let us do this. It just does it. And the question is, how would you integrate the idea of intentionality into this way of thinking? The other difficulty for me, is this is a terribly abstract and impersonal way of thinking. How does this connect up with the idea of, in some way, God choosing to create, as to use a human analogy, as I might choose to create a work of art, such as those around this lecture hall? And it doesn't really. So what I'm going to say to you is, look, this is interesting. It belongs a long time ago. I don't think we really think like this anymore, but the next two really connect up with us very, very well. So we're going to talk about those a little bit more. And the image of construction, I think, is very, very natural to us. And it's very significant. You find this idea in the Old Testament a lot. For example, Psalm 127, verse 1, is very much about the idea of God constructing the world. God is, if you like, a master builder. And it's a very elegant way of thinking, and it comes very naturally to us. What you're saying is that in some way, God can be seen as constructing the universe. Obviously, we need to unpack that a bit more. But that the wisdom of God is seen in the beauty or the elegance or the orderedness of the structure of the world. And as we hear in London, it is a very obvious analogy which lies to hand, not that far away. Many of you will have visited St. Paul's Cathedral, and you will have seen the little memorial tablet to Christopher Wren. It's written in Latin, obviously, but the Latin translated means something like this: if you are looking for a memorial, then look around you. If you're looking for a memorial, look around you. And what's being said is, look, instead of writing a memorial saying Christopher Wren was a really very splendid architect and going on like that, you say, look, there's no need to do that. Look at this cathedral and you will think how great Christopher Wren was. So there's this idea that thinking about the universe as something that's constructed gives you a way of thinking about how the universe can bear witness to God's wisdom, which is a very important theme of any Christian understanding of creation. So it's very accessible, it's quite helpful, but some of you will say, well, that may be the case, but there's an obvious drawback, and it is this. Basically, what about this idea of creation out of nothing? Because the idea of construction is, in effect, of somebody taking things that are already there and then rearranging them or developing them so that something much better happens as a result. But it's not about bringing things into existence from nothing. It's taking stuff that's already there and rearranging it to give a much more pleasing and satisfying outcome. So one of the questions would be, does that actually work all that well? Interesting, but time isn't on our side. Let's move and look at the idea of artistic expression, which is a very, very easy image for us to understand. Many Christian theologians use this, going back even to the late classical antiquity period. And the idea is here that you think of a work of art. It might be a statue, it might be a painting, it might be a novel. And the argument is that the artist's genius or wisdom is expressed in the work of art. That there is some connection between the intelligence or the originality or the creativity of the writer or painter or sculptor, and you see that embodied and reflected in the artistic masterpiece that they produce. And that's a very natural way for us to think. I imagine many of you will know Dorothy L. Sayers' very famous book, The Mind of the Maker, and she, as a novelist herself, just writes in that book how she finds the idea of creation as artistic expression very natural to her as an artist. This is what I do, she says, and actually it helps me understand how I take my ideas and embody them and see something similar in the world around me. So it basically is saying there is something beautiful about the world, and that beauty can be tracked back to the artist, so that the beauty of the created work is seen as reflecting the wisdom or the intelligence or the creativity of the artist. So again, it's a very interesting idea. Again, you might say there are some difficulties with this. Let me mention two. One is, again, it does seem to, again, depend on there being material already available, which can be worked in this way. But another issue, which I think many of you will probably have been just turning over in your minds as I've been speaking, is this. Look, if you think of a painting, you know where to look to find the signature, to tell you who painted it. By analogy, how do you know where in creation to look for the signature of the artist? Again, remember that point I made earlier about the ambiguity of nature. Some bits are beautiful, sunsets, the night sky. Some bits aren't so nice. For example, wolves chasing elks and killing them. It's not very nice. So where is the signature of God found? And again, there's a very interesting debate about this, but many would say, although the argument that leads to this point is quite difficult, many would say that actually perhaps it's in the moments of greatest beauty that you see God's imprint on the natural order. In other words, God made everything, but God is especially well disclosed through some parts rather than other parts of nature. So where does this take us? Well, I think one of the themes I've been emphasizing is this idea of ordering. I've talked about particularly in relation to the Old Testament, but you can see it's also there in these three models of creation that I've been playing with, particularly in the second and third. And of course, it is a major theme in thinking about the linkage between science and religion, because the presupposition of so much science is an ordered universe which somehow can be represented using mathematics. And what I'm going to do is put on the screen a very well-known epitaph. This is Alexander Pope writing some words in praise of Isaac Newton. And you remember, Newton was the one who in effect showed that there were basically deep intellectual connections between the falling of bodies to the earth, the orbiting of planets around the sun, and in effect developed the idea of laws of nature. I mean, Newton in many ways gave that phrase, the laws of nature, the high profile it has today. The idea certainly is there earlier, but Newton really made it into the sort of leitmotif that we have it today. Pope wrote these words. He wrote, "Nature and nature's law lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." In other words, Newton basically gave you a sort of lens through which you could see the world, and what previously was there but not obvious suddenly became absolutely clear. So one of the points I want to make is that the doctrine of creation does actually give you this intellectual framework for saying there is an explicable regularity to the world of nature. It's not random, it's not chaotic, it's not arbitrary. There is something there that's structured, which the human mind can discern and represent mathematically. And that takes you, I think, in some very interesting directions. Now, there are, I think, important points to make here. Let's look at Paul Davies. Paul Davies, the mind of God. Paul Davies is a physicist who I think is very interested in the deeper philosophical, religious and so on implications of modern physics. And he's talking here about his understanding of the laws of nature. And what he's saying is, look, are these just happenstance? Are they just things that we invent? Or is there something really deeply embedded in nature which means it behaves like this? And he writes these words: "I believe any suggestion that the laws of nature are projections of the human mind is absurd. The existence of regularities in nature is an objective mathematical fact. In conducting science, we are uncovering real regularities and linkages out of nature, not writing them into nature." Now, just hold what Paul Davies is saying in your mind's eye. There's a big debate amongst historians of science, and it goes like this. What we call the scientific revolution, the exponential growth in scientific inquiry, which really dates from the 16th, 17th centuries, that happened in Western Europe, which was a Christian area of the world. Is that accidental? Is there some sort of connection between some ideas of Christianity and the emergence of a scientific revolution? I would have to say to you, this is a very complicated question, and it's unwise to give simple answers. But you can see there might be some connection between this idea of God establishing a regular world and the success of science. So it's an interesting area to explore, although I have to say it's more complex than I can really hope to deal with in the time that I have available. Now, the time that I have available is shrinking quite quickly, but what I want to do now in this final part of the lecture is to move on and really reconnect with that theme that I opened up right at the beginning of this lecture, and it's this. We're back now with this idea of the Big Bang, that in some way the universe came into being in this moment, this very brief moment, which we sometimes call the Big Bang. And one of the questions is, where does this take us, this line of thinking? Now, at one level, as I was saying earlier, it's about, in effect, this being perhaps consistent with the Christian idea of creation, but it doesn't prove anything. So what I want to do now is introduce a second idea, which is not so much the Big Bang itself, but this idea that I mentioned but didn't really explain properly at the beginning of this lecture, which is the idea of fine-tuning. What is that, and what does it mean? Well, basically, a writer like Paul Davies, for example, would say, look, whatever we make of this, we observe that the universe appears to have certain fundamental properties which are bio-friendly, if you like, which in effect seem to help life come into existence. And he writes some very interesting words. This is a quote from Paul Davies. I don't know if I actually put this on here. No. Let me read this to you. This is from Paul Davies. Again, just reflecting on the fact that the constants of nature, things that we didn't invent but are already there in nature, seem to be, well, like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right for the emergence of life. He writes, the seemingly miraculous concurrence of numerical values that nature has assigned to a fundamental constants must remain the most compelling evidence for an element of cosmic design. So you'll be saying, well, look, can you just talk a bit more about what these constants of nature are and what is so interesting about them? I'm going to do that. But let me just emphasize one point before moving on. There's the Big Bang, the idea the universe had an origin. That's one thing. There's something different. It is that when the universe came into being, it was governed by certain fundamental constants of nature. Had they been different, then actually the universe might not have evolved at all, might be very, very different, and you and I wouldn't be having this discussion here today. And really the question is, well, so what? But before I can explore the so what bit of this question, I need to look in more detail at some of the issues that we need to look at. What I'm going to do, if I may, is just mention some examples of the constants of nature which seem to be set at levels that actually are remarkably in line with what they would need to be for the emergence of life. And here are just some examples. Many of you will know all about this already, so I'm just refreshing your memories. Some of you won't, so I'm just trying to give you an idea of what these are. One of them is what is called the strong coupling constant. Again, the strong coupling constant. Don't worry what this is. The point is, if it was very slightly smaller, then at the Big Bang, we would have produced hydrogen and hydrogen alone. And life needs a lot more than hydrogen. You need, in effect, other elements to be produced. But of course, in the early period of the Big Bang, it was simply hydrogen, helium, and lithium, the lightest elements. the heavier elements, including carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, which are essential to life, were produced in the cores of stars. Stars, in effect, have this massive gravity, massive temperatures, and in their cores, these thermonuclear reactions take place, which produce carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, lots of other elements that are essential to life. And a key point here is that if one of the other constants, the weak fine constant, was very small, then basically we wouldn't be talking about there being stars at all. It's one of those things where, again, it's just right for the production of these elements that we need. So people began to use this word fine-tuning. What they meant by that is that it's as if the fundamental constants of nature, which were built into the structure of things at the time of the Big Bang, seem to have this very special values. And here's the writer Freeman Dyson. Again, Dyson is a well-known physicist. As we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must, in some sense, have known that we were coming. That's a lovely phrase. I'm going to leave that on the screen so you can enjoy it. But I need to begin to work at this. We need to make a distinction between an observation and its interpretation. The observation is not actually particularly controversial. The observation is that these fundamental constants of nature seem to be about the right level so that life could come into existence. What's much more controversial is what that means, if anything. What I'm going to do, if I may, is just talk you through some ways of understanding that so you're aware of the debate. I'll gladly tell you where I stand on this one, but it is a very interesting debate and it is ongoing. So here we go. Obviously, if you take the view that a wise God made the universe, which is what I suppose a Christian would say, then I think what you would have to say is something like this. You have to say, look, I concede that fine-tuning proves nothing. Proves in that strong sense of the word. But then I think I would say it suggests quite a lot. In other words, this fits into a Christian way of thinking very, very naturally, very, very easy. It's consistent with it, but it doesn't coerce anyone to say that's right. In other words, the logical process is not so much fine-tuning makes you think, oh, there must be a God. It's much more, if you already believe in God and think God is like this, and then you take this framework to these observations, you say, well, actually, this fits in quite well, doesn't it? But it's not coercive. It's simply suggestive. So that's one approach. Of course, there are others. Those who don't take a religious standpoint would say, well, look, given that these observations exist, maybe this is just an accident, a very nice accident, but it is simply the way things are. It requires no explanation. It's just the way things are. If you like, it's a throw of the dice. It's the way it is. It doesn't need explanation. Now, Peter Atkins, who some of you may have read, a physical chemist who has strongly anti-religious views, would say, look, fine-tuning might seem to be miraculous, but actually, when you look more closely, you can simply say, well, look, the fundamental constants of nature had to have some value, so why not these ones? These simply are what they are, and you don't need to talk about purpose or intention. It's just that we got lucky. They had to have some value, and we are just lucky enough that they had values that made a universe which is habitable for life. And to give you an obvious example, the population of the United States is about 300 million, and there's only one president, but someone has to be president. So, it's highly improbable any one individual would be that president. but that there is a president is not in itself particularly improbable. Now, there's another issue here which many of you will have been thinking about as I've been talking, and you would say, well, look, there's another dimension to this, and it's what's called the multiverse. In very simple terms, this is the idea which emerges from our understanding of the early history of the universe. It's one way of making sense of it. There are others, but this is one way, is to say that actually it's not so much that there is one universe and that's it. There actually are multiple universes, many of them. And we inhabit this one. But what of the others? And again, if Peter Atkins were here, he would say, well, of course, many of the other universes have values which don't allow life at all. Maybe it's just our universe which is special, and because we are here in this universe, we think only about it. But there are many other universes in which they didn't get lucky. So in effect, we simply are reflecting on this as inhabitants of a special universe in which we were lucky, and it's simply, if you like, a matter of luck. And there's nothing more that needs to be said. At the logical level, that's right. So what I'm saying to you is, look, this is really interesting. I'm afraid it's also inconclusive, but nevertheless, it's a fascinating question to explore. And there are other fascinating questions to explore which emerge from the doctrine of creation. And one of them is one we're going to look at next time we meet. In this lecture, what I've been doing is focusing on, if you like, the physical side of the doctrine of creation, the universe, the Big Bang. But many of you will say, well, look, we need to talk also about the biological side. What about Charles Darwin? He's interesting. How do his ideas fit into this? Well, excellent. And that's exactly what we'll look at in our next lecture, to which I look forward very, very much. But we have time for some questions. And let me apologize immediately to those who are down below. I'm afraid we can't hear you. But I'm sure there'll be some excellent questions in this lecture hall, and I hope that they ask the questions you'd like them to ask. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening.